Welcome to the Journey Podcast. Let's grow together and let's reshape the health and fitness industry for the better. Welcome back to the Journey Podcast, episode 4. And I just want to launch straight into it today, guys, because we're going to be covering two very important subjects. The first being how you can have a healthier overall relationship with the scales. I find that so many people, myself included, have had a very tarred and feathered kind of history with the scales and see them as something that ultimately is like a metric of self-worth. I have had a very emotionally charged relationship with the scales. So we're going to be looking at why that's the case, obviously trying to look at that through the lens of the lessons that life has taught me, but also the things that I've experienced in clinic to help you understand from actual real world experience how you can have a healthier relationship with the scales, but also understand why you have the relationship with the scales that you do at the moment. So we're going to look at all that and how you can actually improve that. Then we're going to pivot into part 2, which we're going to then be looking at what seems like a very simple statement on the surface, but has made a massive difference for me in at least the last year in terms of taking action in my life and making changes. And that's simply the statement that if nothing changes, nothing changes, which again sounds very simple, but I really want to dive into that a little bit and to kind of show how I've taken that on board and the light bulb moments that has sort of initiated and the changes that have come off the back of that. Okay, so let's launch into it. First part of the podcast, let's look at that relationship with the scales. And first, let's look at why the scales are, well, let's throw a pun in, why the scales are weighing you down. Okay, so like I said, a lot of folks have a very emotionally charged relationship with the scales. Okay, it's not it's not this analytical tool, which it should be. It's not there just to provide data. It's there almost as like a whip of self-criticism. You're not using it to evaluate change and progress. You're using it as a potential stick to beat yourself with day in, day out. The scales themselves, the data that you're extracting from those, that should be helpful, not harmful. It's just feedback. It's not judgment. And it seems so simple to say that on the surface, but even for someone, like me, who is a coach, who has worked with so many people, who's had all the trials and tribulations like I'd highlighted in previous episodes, my relationship with the scales was for the longest time appalling. I used to, do all the cliches. I'd weigh once a week. I'd starve myself the day before and just hope to God that the number had gone down. Because if the number hadn't have gone down, that would have meant that my whole week would have been a write-off. No matter what processes I had followed, no matter what actions I had taken, no matter what PRs I had hit, no matter what I'd achieved, that little number in that little plastic box in the bathroom, that was the sole barometer for whether I'd had a successful week or not. And I think that was one of the many elements that served as a catalyst for me engaging in really unhealthy behaviors and spiraling into a very unhealthy way. Now, I kind of want to touch on sort of why that is the case and why there are many reasons why someone could develop a potentially poor relationship with the scales. But unlike previous podcast episodes, I've actually taken some notes for this because I don't want to get lost in the stories and things, and I want to sort of keep it focused. And so I've got some notes here for why I believe, or at least from my experience, and having looked at the evidence around this, why people can develop an unhealthy relationship with not just their weight, but the scales specifically. So the first of those is that the scales can serve as an extension of misplaced control. So weight is often treated as a metric of worth, and that could be, there's many reasons why someone may see it or perceive it that way. Obviously, you're very sort of close familial links, and I often find that this is very heavily influenced in the maternal link, And that's likely because women have been subjected to how they look, how much they weigh, what they eat, et cetera, et cetera, their aesthetic appeal. That's ultimately been their barometer of worth in society. It's not what they can contribute. It's, what they are as an individual and in terms of how they look and ultimately I'm not too sure if we're ever going to escape from that because I think societal standards are actually getting worse when it comes to that and there's a lot of trends, very unhelpful, very harmful trends around how women should look, how women should move, how women should eat. There's a greater push now for women of all sizes, not just those who necessarily may benefit from them, but all sizes of women who are being pushed to take these GLP-1 drugs. And I think it's very harmful. But for the longest time, women's worth has been essentially measured by how they look or the size of their body, maybe potentially as well. And again, smaller the person, likely the higher they're going to rank in terms of the societal beauty standards. And that's just what it is. But hopefully we can change that because I think that's a very damaging message. And I certainly wouldn't want my daughter to grow up in a world like that. But you can only change it by shifting one person's perspective at a time. And hopefully then the greater forces in society will then start to move with that as well. And I do think there has been a really positive push for women to move away from just being skinny and frail to more athletic, getting into the gym, having a presence in there and also being accepted in there as well. I think there was this sort of misnomer that men wouldn't want women in that space. And ultimately, like men would rather share that space with them, because it's something like men love training for the most part. And so if we can have an even bigger community that is involved in that, that loves that, we would love it to grow. So welcome one and all to the gym. Keep coming in, but just don't take the machines if I need them, or the dumbbells, or the free stuff. Just let me train in my own little bubble. You know what I'm trying to say? Um, But no, in all seriousness, so the paternal link is very strong, particularly between mother and daughter. But overall, family influence can be very, very potent, especially for children and parents. And that's mostly because parents are going to be people that you have the most sort of interactions with when you're younger. When you're younger, your brain is trying to form stories of the world to keep itself safe, to keep itself secure, to understand what it needs to be loved and taken care of, and things like that. And so if it starts to perceive weight as important, particularly if parents are always talking about dieting or I've lost weight, I've done this, I've done that, then those sort of beliefs will then be taken on board, and they can be very deeply ingrained, especially from a younger age. And there are studies that have shown that parents who are very diet focused, very sort of weight focused, their children are presenting with weight concerns at a much earlier age. And so you see how those things can be imprinted upon children. So it's very important that parents are conscious of that. But that's just so if there's that sort of familial link as to why um, people may sort of see the scale as being a measure of worth. But there's also, like I said, there's the overarching societal influence. There's a whole industry, the whole diet industry is centered around if that little box shows a lower number, you're winning, which is not always the case because if someone is not well, if someone is injured or something like that, or there's many reasons why someone could lose weight that has nothing to do with intentional weight loss. And so I feel like we need to move away from that narrative. Maybe not completely, but it's almost gone to the polar extreme. And we need to rein it back in a wee bit because now people are just sort of seeing that as the sole barometer of progress. And that's potentially why so many folks are coming out the other side of these extreme diets, these GLP-1 interventions, and they are doing the most insane things to see that number drive downwards as quickly as possible. Because they think if they do that, number go down, life gets better. And that is not always the case, unfortunately. And I think that is a very difficult thing to live with. Um, so anyway, weight being a measure of worth, generally speaking, if weight then goes down, self-worth goes up. If weight, however, remains the same or even goes up, that it will actually trigger feelings of guilt, shame, failure, so on and so forth. And again, I sort of mentioned at the start, the scale can be an extension of misplaced control. And so it is that sort of focus on over controlling the diet, over controlling the exercise, seeing that number go down and not seeing it go down. The irony of that is if that number doesn't align with what you'd hope for, and we'll talk about why that's the case later on, that can actually lead to the inverse. And it can lead to a whole host of unhealthy behaviors, namely a lot of overeating and emotional eating, can even spiral into binge eating for some people. And then, of course, if you're engaging in this sort of unhealthy relationship with food, it might even involve like a whole host of unhealthy sort of responses. You might be like, ah, well, sure, I'm just going to have a bottle of wine, or I'm not going to exercise today. What's the point? I'm going to be more isolated. I'm not going to get to sleep on time. The whole day then becomes a write-off, and the whole week then feels like a write-off as well because all those things that you had worked so hard for are not reflected then in that one little metric. So then the weight going up actually leads to the weight going further up because your response to that is not an objective one or an analytical one. It's a very emotional one. And so then you turn to the things that you may have used then to cope with, whether that be alcohol, food, whatever. But generally, it leads to you not taking care of yourself. Unsurprisingly, then you'll start to see the weight actually starting to go up again off the back of that. So, so that's kind of the first point. The second point would be more along this sort of perfectionist kind of mindset, the need to over control and the scale being a tool for that. So the reason why I highlighted that and the reason why it's different from the first point is more to do with the nature of weight itself. And weight is an erratic measurement and not one that you can reliably expect to move in a linear direction each day, each week, because there's so many different factors that go into it. And ultimately, with that perfectionist mindset, the reason why I wanted to highlight that was it's not that people are necessarily over controlling. Well, they are. They're over controlling on the food or the exercise. But that perfectionist mindset, particularly with weight and the scale, means then if you're not seeing that linear progression in the direction that you would want, for people with that perfectionist sort of like all or nothing mindset, which is really just I set a bar too high, I'll never reach, so that means I can continue to fulfill my belief that I'm a failure. That just means then that they can continue then to basically fulfill that belief that they will never achieve what they want. They'll fulfill that narrative that I know I'm setting the barometer, or sorry, the bar too high here. I know I won't lose weight linearly, day on day, week on week, month on month. It doesn't work that way. And eventually I'll not be dieting anymore. But the perfectionist mindset says, well, you have to be. And it has to always be moving in the right direction because if it doesn't, guess what? You failed again, which is what we expect because you are kind of a failure anyway. So perfectionist mindset is another one. The third point that I wanted to highlight was the the potentially harmful influence of external validation when it comes to the scales and how that can really negatively influence your relationship with the scales, right? And it's not that we should never celebrate weight loss, but I think whenever you put that on a pedestal, external validation can be, for lack of a better way to put it, external validation can be like a drug. And overuse, over reliance of any drug is not a good thing. And so, whilst external validation can help, with sort of brief kind of injections of positive emotion or motivation or fighting through a difficult day or making just feel like this is all worth it, external validation shouldn't be the driver because that means that you're always going to have to chase a lower weight to continue to receive that external validation. And that's a train that has to keep on accelerating, on the track. And if a train just keeps going quicker and quicker and quicker, eventually it's going to come flying off that track, and that is something that I really struggled with. Off the back of that rugby injury, I, again, I was being complimented for the weight that I was losing because everyone had sort of known me previously as being this bigger person. And again, we celebrate that weight loss, which neither good nor bad. It depends on the context. But in this context, I was misusing that external validation to keep pushing me towards a lower, 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 lower weight. And so the external validation went from positive to more of concern. And so it wasn't validating anymore. It was concern. And then that was a very confusing time for me because it's like, well, I've lost weight, so why is it now a negative? Why are people now saying I've lost too much weight? Who are they to say that? They've just told me I was losing weight. That's a good thing. And that's the danger with external validation, is it is like a train on the tracks. It just keeps accelerating to the point where it will run off the tracks completely and you're left with an absolute disaster. So that's why you shouldn't pursue or at least prioritize external validation when it comes to weight loss success. Because again, it's just going to destroy your relationships, not just with scales, but I think it could potentially lead to um, cataclysmic issues with your health. It did for me. So I can only speak from experience. And I know a lot of people who have been through the ringer with your Slimming Worlds, your Weight Watchers, etc. Do you know, I always remember the Little Britain sketch where they stand at the front and, you know, they get a high five for losing weight and then they get berated in front of the class, if they don't lose weight. And it's not actually too dissimilar to the reality of the situation for these slimming clubs. So I would just be mindful of that. Just don't chase that dragon, so to speak. Don't chase the dragon of people complimenting you. Like people complimenting you is like sprinkles on the cake, so to speak. It's something nice, but it's that sort of like internal change, that internal shift in narrative where it's like I'm experiencing all these benefits of taking better care of myself. Yes, I'm getting these sort of external rewards. That's okay. It's nice to have, but not something I need to have because I'm the one who's actually pushing myself forward because I want to take better care of myself because this is my journey, because this is the things that I want to pursue. None of those people know what I want to pursue. They might be sort of cheering me on here, there, and wherever, but I can't rely on that. And so what matters most is for me to pursue the best version of my life. And so I'm going to keep going for me. Or if you're like a parent or whatever, or if you're in a relationship, sometimes the pursuit of that best self is for them. Like for me, a lot of the time, because of the nature of how busy I am and things like that, um, I have to make taking care of myself a priority, not always for myself, but because my family rely on me. And if I'm not healthy, not good. Okay. So, um, final wee point in terms of influences that could sort of negatively impact that relationship with the scales would be um, how that weight change moving in an undesired direction can actually serve as essentially like a painful reminder of the past, whether that be past attempts or failures or things that you have tried and all the misery around that, or even reinforcement of perceived failures or this sort of deep-rooted feeling of you have this defined inability to succeed. And this is just one other outlet for that, and that's another really difficult thing to contend with when it comes to the relationship with the scales. Because again, the problem with that data is that it's very binary. We treat it binary, but we don't treat it with the context of why it would change. It's just did it go up or down? If it didn't go in the direction I wanted to, fail. If it did, that's what I expected. But we don't measure that with the context of why it would potentially not move in the direction that we wanted to, or why it had actually moved in the direction that we had wanted to, or why it even maintained. We don't care about that in the context. We only care about it in the binary. It's that sort of black and white thinking that's very sort of harmful. So it is. Um, so that's kind of the final point is it can serve as a bit of a painful reminder, especially for folks who have had um, a history of very restrictive dieting. And so if those previous attempts, failures, whatever you want to call them, if they were linked to, say, extreme caloric restriction or very rigid control, the scale then becomes a reminder of those struggles, of that body that they were in at that time, or that frame of mind that they were in at that time, or even just the failed previous attempts, where there would have been potentially even external criticism, or what's the best way to put it? It's when, or even those times when the people that you would rely on to support you are the first ones to say, I told you so. And like that's like a dagger in the heart. But that's what that can remind you of a lot of the time. So it's really important to sort of understand why we have this relationship in the this change in relationship in the first place. And that actually made all the difference for me was that I started to kind of move out of this fog of it was just me and the scale and started to think, well, why did I have that relationship with the scales? Where did that come from? But also to take more of an objective mindset with it. Do you know why would it change day to day, week to week, or why didn't it? And I used to, like I said, I used to weigh like once a week, and I was doing that from when I was very heavy to when I was very light. And the more that you sort of move towards those lighter weights, and the less that you sort of change things up, the more minuscule the changes on the scales are going to be, if any. And so you can't expect linear weight loss, especially not if you're taking a snapshot of the week once a week. Like that's insanity. I always say it's like playing Russian roulette with your mental health, you know? And anyway, the thing that made a big difference for me again was understanding, firstly, why I had this extremely unhealthy relationship with the scales. And this is the exact same thing I do with the clients that I work with. I help them understand why. And then we start to explore, well, what would influence it in the first place? Because it means then, you find out what the problem is, right? Why is there water getting into the house in the first place? Where's the pipes burst? And then how you can actually fix the pipes. And that's by having a better understanding of why weight changes so erratically from day to day, because then you can be more rational, you can be more objective, you can be more empathetic, you can be more curious, less critical. So here's some of the reasons why it can change from day to day. I'm sure you've heard of all these, but you've got everything from when you've had your last meal, fluid intake, sleep hygiene, alcohol intake. Alcohol intake's a big one. You've got the humidity, or even just your environment. So, like, if you're like me, you're a very pale, sort of, you're like what do they call? Like a cold-blooded creature like myself. If you move into a slightly warmer environment, I'm not talking about Spain, I'm talking about like, double digits temperatures, a lot more sweating. And so weight will naturally tend to go down because your body will be excreting a lot more water through that. And a good example of that would be um, sort of related to your training as well. So your weight can be influenced by what you've trained and when you've trained. So for myself, and I know for some of my clients, if they do something like a lower body focus day, their weight might actually be up the next day. But if they were to go for a run, and then measure themselves either the next day or that morning after the run, some of them can lose easily over a kilo, do you know? And it's not like they've shifted a kilo and lost like a kilo of body weight within, at least not like sort of more fixed body weight in terms of actual tissue or bone mass or what have you. But it's the amount of water that they could lose, or glycogen that they're using up, etc., from the training itself. And with the reason why they might gain weight from that, it could be, well, there's obviously there's an inflammatory response after training, but there's also going to be changes in body water, glycogen, etc. as well. So just things to consider, uh, beyond just what we sort of anticipate. Then you've also got factors like food moving through your gut. That'll be related to the composition of your diet. So diets that are higher in protein and fiber, you will tend to have maybe slightly higher weight, just because those things tend to digest slower. Fiber, for one thing, doesn't digest at all. We don't have the enzymes to break that down. And so it forms, say, like the bulk of our stools, or it can also, you have insoluble and soluble fiber. Insoluble is sort of like that spongy fiber that you kind of associate with, soaks up the water, and don't want to get too graphic. That's kind of like your poop. And then you've got soluble fiber, which again is also part of that, but it tends to form more of a gel-like substance, maybe more renowned for binding to, say, like free cholesterol in the digestive tract and things like that. And both kinds of fiber can help to slow down the rate of digestion and improve satiety and what have you. But your body can't digest those things. And so if they're in your system, your weight will be up because it's that is in your system, right? So it just kind of makes sense. And then there's the obvious, you know, like whether you've gone to the bathroom or not that day. And let me tell you, I've worked with, this is not so much maybe a point of contention with men. I think men are very simple creatures a lot of the time. But women certainly, I would say to them, I would ask them how they would normally, sort of measure themselves and things like that. And they say, oh, I do this, this, or so. And I say, okay, I just want you to try this one time. You will be both surprised, potentially disgusted. I want you to weigh yourself before number two and after number two. And it will make you really question how ladylike you are, after that, because there will be some form of disgusting curiosity with that. But needless to say, some of the women who have lost quite a lot from doing that surprise me. You know who you are. So I think it's interesting, surprising, a little disgusting, but I think the thing that has shocked me the most is how interested they were about it after they'd done it. And some of them repeat it as well a couple of times, just double check. So I don't know, maybe there's a little bit of that sort of childhood curiosity in them, at the end of the day. And then just the final one I wanted to touch on were, um, I would say, probably one of the more significant, and one of the ones that we tend to have least control over, and that would be hormonal changes. So I'd say maybe more pronounced in women than men, obviously, because there's many different reasons as to what would influence a woman's sort of hormonal profile. You have the menstrual cycle itself. If they're perimenopausal, things will be all over the place all the time. You could also have various forms of birth control, pregnancy. Well, there's obviously another reason why your body weight might go up for pregnancy, but there's definitely a hormonal contribution to that. And then for men, there's a natural decline in testosterone over age, as you age, sorry. So that potentially may lead to a decline in weight over time. If you lose lean muscle mass, for example, although the mission should be to try and preserve as much of that as possible and trying to stave off any accrual of excess visceral body fat. But I think with men, it's well, I suppose women, it's also exogenous hormones, but men, it would also be exogenous hormones. So whether there be, say, taking some form of anabolic agent, or if they're on TRT or something like that, there could be an influence. Um, Even if people are taking certain medications as well, that will also have an influence on weight. So there's many, 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 many different reasons as to why weight would change day by day. Okay. And I think once you understand that, you can then, again, like the whole point of this is to adopt that curiosity over criticism mindset, to not default to beating yourself up, but to go to like, well, why did it change? Because I followed my process. I've done what I needed to do. I have ticked my boxes. So why did it change the way it changed? Okay. Because then you can be at peace with what you had done rather than just judging all of your efforts based on the result. Because that's not a fair thing to do, especially for something like a scale weight, which is highly erratic. And also one of the massive things that people get wrong all the time with scale weight is they equivocate scale weight is body fat. So if scale weight goes down, body fat goes down, and that is not the case at all. One of the things that I do with my sort of like my high level athletes who are involved in either combat sports or weightlifting, who basically they have to meet a certain weight criteria to perform, in competitions. One of the things that we do is an acute weight cut. And an acute weight cut involves manipulating a lot of those factors that I had just mentioned that contribute to day-to-day fluctuations. We are not restricting their total food intake. You know, the aim is not to try and lose body fat because it's too late at that stage of the day to try and drop body fat, that close to competition. In fact, it would actually probably be detrimental to performance. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to manipulate body water and we're trying to manipulate food moving through the digestive tract, trying to reduce those as much as possible. And if you can do that, your body weight can change anywhere from probably 5 to 10% of its total body weight, depending on the person, 5 to 10% of its total body weight. It's one of the reasons as well, whenever you see someone who moves over to, say, like a low carb diet, for example. Now, there are other reasons why they may start to see, changes downwards in their weight, but that initial jump is going to be all down to temporary changes. Particularly, it's going to be changes in the digestive tract, in terms of the food volume in there, and a lot of changes in body water too. But those diets do a very good job of manipulating people into thinking that they've lost a lot more weight than what they think they have. And they always think it is body fat, and it is not body fat. You're not losing a stone of body fat in a week. You would have to probably cut off a leg to do that. So, and I wouldn't recommend it. But anyway, hopefully that kind of clears things up on scale weight and sort of why it changes day to day. And I just very finally want to go over how you can start the process of trying to make the scale a friend and not a foe. Okay. Now, the first step of that is always developing an understanding. You need to identify your unique attachment, your unique story, your unique relationship with the scale first and foremost. If you don't know why you're afraid of it to begin with, it's going to be very difficult to try and rehabilitate it in terms of that relationship. But the more that you can understand it, and I think I've spoken about this before, there's a big difference between sitting with a child who's afraid of a monster under the bed or in the cupboard, and when you're with them, they feel secure, they feel confident, they're like, this is great, I can go back to sleep now. What the minute that you leave, within an hour, they're going to be back in the room again. Mommy, mommy, daddy, daddy, there's a monster in the bed, there's a monster in the cupboard. And you have to go back in, repeat the process, do it all over again. Now, extrapolate that to this. That would be like someone who's, the mummy or daddy for them is the weight loss going down, right? Or the diet that they're going to, or the coach that they're working with, whatever it could be. It's a temporary solution. It doesn't deal with the actual problem. But if you can show them that the reason why the scale has that hold over them is to do with the influences they had when they were younger, perfectionist mindset, external validation needs, all those other things, or whatever it might be, then they can start to change, rewire their brain with the relationship, that they have with the scales to start to treat the scales for what it is, like a tool. It's basically it's analytical feedback. It is numbers that reflect, your weight in relation to gravity and stuff like that. Like it's not this is where you rank in society because you're this. And that's like the parent, instead of just sitting with them and going there, that's like them showing the child, okay, the monster in the cupboard is just, your coat hanging funny, or the jumpers that you've left at your behind under the bed, you know. So then they actually can start to challenge the old narratives because they now understand what it was that they were initially afraid of, what they were initially anxious of, what they were initially so fear-ridden or sort of guilt-ridden about. And it's like, I worried because of that. Okay, understandable. I'm not going to beat myself up over that because that's just going to dig a different hole or a deeper hole. Let me try and let me try and shift this now. Let me try and rework this now. Let me try and reframe that and have a new relationship with the skills or rehabilitate this one that I have so that I can use it or incorporate it in my life if I'm going to, in a way that helps me to move forward, in a way that I can use as positive feedback, or just feedback as a whole. Like it's just data. It's no different than the sleep that you get from your Whoop or the heart rate that you get from your Garmin. It's no different. It's just we tend to think that it is this great big measuring stick of success, and it's not. Okay, so identify that unique attachment first, and then, like I said, the next step is taking an analytical approach to that data that you're getting. It is judgment, not feedback. That if you're going to repeat anything, just repeat that. It is uh, what did I say? It is feedback, not judgment. I said it was judgment, not feedback. Flip that in its head. The data is feedback, not judgment. And I would also say that it would be important to focus on other indicators of progress too, both qualitative and quantitative. So, say, for example, your diet becoming more nutritious, you're increasing your comfortability and control around food. You have more structure with your diet. You feel better both physically and mentally. Your strength and performance in the gym is improving. You may even start to get involved in other forms of exercise or get involved in groups who are now training as well. You might feel more confident wearing different clothes. You might be fitting, in terms of your perception, better in certain clothes. You might be moving more freely. You might have more flexibility, mobility. There might be improvements in your day-to-day energy levels, your digestion, your overall well-being, how you're performing at work. There might even be improvements in sleep. You might even be feeling less stressed. There's a whole host of other things. There's a whole host of other things that you could focus on that are not just the scale. The scale is one part of that sort of picture that you can use as feedback for, is the plan that I have in front of me, is that working? Am I moving in that direction? And if it's not the end of the world. You just need to make some changes to get that thing moving. That's all you have to do. That's all you have to do. And then the final wee point for making the scale um, friend and not foe is actually going to be coming down to how you're recording that data. And this is very important because you want to be consistent with it. There's nothing worse than taking inconsistent recordings for something that is already erratic because that will drive you mad. You're basically, yeah, again, you're rolling the dice every time, okay? For something that you're already rolling the dice with. So my advice when it comes to weighing yourself, either commit to doing it multiple times a week or don't do it at all, first and foremost. Again, you can get away with doing it once a week if you're starting off on your journey and potentially if you have more weight to lose. However, if you're further along in your journey, or if you're already sort of at a relatively healthy body weight, or you're already lean, either don't use it at all if you feel like it's going to be detrimental, or record multiple times a week because you want to have a range of data points that you can then start to develop a more accurate trend of. And essentially, the trend over time is going to be the indication as to whether the plan that you have in front of you is actually moving in the right direction. Okay. So this is what you want to do. Wake up, go to the bathroom. Well, wake up, maybe have a black coffee if needs be to get things going. Go to the bathroom, do a one, try and do a two, preferably both. You want to weigh in the same clothes, if any, each and every day, and you want to try and weigh around the same time every single day. So wake up, Coffee optional. You want to weigh before food, but after having gone to the toilet. And you want to do that at least 3 to 4 times a week. And then the lowest weight that you record that week, and this is going to feel like the strangest thing I'm going to say in this, but the lowest weight that you record that week is always going to be the most accurate because it's going to have the least amount of influence from all those other erratic factors. You weigh less than you realize. There are just a lot of other temporary things contributing to the number on the scale. So just understand that, okay? So, exercise for this week is going to be around why weight is not equivalent to worth. And this week's exercise is going to be all about reframing your perspective and improving your relationship with the scale. So I'm going to put that in the description of the video. Um, and it's going to be built from a technique that we use in practice and that I use many, many times. I know it will help massively. You just have to focus on doing it. And it's going to task you with certain things, it's going to task you with certain exercises. But if you do it, if the scale is something that is actually making your life significantly worse, you need to do this. You need to do it because the life that you want to live is on the other side of the work that you're avoiding. And this is likely the work that you're avoiding. So go and give this a go this week, and I swear it will make a huge amount of difference. Okay. And that's the relationship with the scales. Now, I very quickly want to move into the second half of the podcast. This is going to be a more short, sharp, and concise episode. Quite busy this week, so haven't got time to waffle for hours and hours. Um, but I wanted to touch on this sentiment that I had heard that has just made such a big difference for me because I don't know about you. I don't know where you're listening to this from, but in Northern Ireland, there is this sort of culture that we like when people are doing well, but not whenever they're doing better than us. We don't want to stand out. It's because people tend to be very critical of you if you stand out. If you're succeeding, like people like for you to be doing well up to a point, and then they're like, "Whoa, you're doing a bit too well." Rein that in. Rein that in. You can't be too. You're not better than us. And it's not just this sort of positive journey, forward. And I was always very conscious of that. And I think a lot of that came from maybe family members saying, "Oh, how's your wee business doing?" and things like that. And so I wouldn't really push myself. And I would use a lot of excuses for not having done that. Like this podcast, for example. I didn't do the podcast because I thought, well, the setup wasn't great enough. Not enough people will listen to it, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, it doesn't necessarily matter, especially at the beginning, how good it is or what my setup's like or who's listening or how many people. Well, it does matter who's listening because I like people listening. Especially whenever you message me, I really like that. Just because it's like the conversations that I'm having now are really engaging and I think that's part and parcel of long form content that the conversations are better. Um, but not the amount of people that are listening necessarily, you know. And all this is me just wanting to share things that I do day in, day out, and that I have learned that have helped me become a better version of myself, that have helped me to help other people become better versions of themselves. It's not a vanity project, you know. And but what I was getting at with that was I'd held myself back from doing it for a very long time, mainly because I had tried in the past and never felt happy with the product. And it always felt like, who am I to do that? You know? And so last year, towards the end of last year, or maybe I might have heard it earlier than that, but there was a sentiment that I'd heard that was basically like, if nothing changes, nothing changes, and I'm not the same person I was a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whenever I did have a very limiting belief around my life and what I could achieve and how I could take care of my family and how I could contribute to the community, how I could maybe help shift the sentiments of the industry that I'm in to pivot more towards health and happiness and less about looking a certain way, having a certain amount of followers and being very sort of vain and narcissistic and not really health focused. And I think the catalyst for that as well is like, well, definitely whenever you move into parenthood, it's very hard to describe how much of a shift that makes in your head. Um, it feels like the minute that you realize that you're going to have a child, it's like there is this ticking clock. And I appreciate I sound like an absolute lunatic, but it is like this, like that ticking clock over and over and over again. I didn't really do it justice there. I was thinking more of like there's like if you've ever watched Interstellar, they've got like the Hans Zimmer soundtrack, and he's got like the ticking clock going. Um, and we'll talk about that in a different episode because I love Interstellar. And there's one scene in it in particular I just love it. Love it. But it's that sort of ticking clock and I was like, well, I'm static at the moment. And one of the sort of the laws of the universe, so to speak, is if something isn't taken care of, if something isn't progressing, there is a natural law of entropy, that thing will decay. And to me, it's a lot like if the business isn't moving forward, the business is moving backwards because the rest of the industry is always moving forward. All these other people around me are always moving forward. And so it sort of dawned on me after I heard this that if nothing changes, nothing changes. And so why don't I push? Why don't I try? Why don't I work with this person? Do you know? And so I started to explore business mentors and I was burned several times. I spent a lot of money, but I at my core, I understood that I needed a lot like whenever I'm working with someone, you need someone to guide you through the parts that you can't quite piece together yourself. And I don't think there's anything wrong in that whatsoever. It's like I love coaching. And then there was something else that I had heard earlier this year that just like light bulb moments went on. And it wasn't just that if nothing changes, nothing changes. It was if you're not changing it, you're choosing it. And I was like, and it's so right. Do you know, like you could have the life that you want if you choose it. But if you're not changing what you're doing right now to get there, then you're also choosing where you're at, if that makes sense. And I know when it comes to like finances and all this kind of stuff that we live in this capitalist society where the big bads at the top have all the money and the rest of us are all just looking up and but I can't change that. So I don't concern myself with it. I'm not up here trying to be like Jeff Bezos. See you, give me more of your money, please. Give me more of those Bezos bucks. He's not listening to me. He doesn't know I exist. I think he might actually be in space. So I'm not concerned with those things that are so far out of my control, I can't do anything about them. I want to localize the things that I can control to me, to around me. And what I can control at all times are the things that I'm working towards, my actions, my perspective, and my willingness to take extreme accountability and responsibility for the aspects in my life that I want to see improve. And that is everything. And so the business mentor I work with, he said something to me the other day. He said, I could have very easily sat on my hands and had stayed a coach and did this, that, and the other and been very well off. But I didn't just want that. And I was relentless. And yes, people judge me. And yes, it didn't always go to plan, but I was relentless. And now I can retire. And I'm 5 years older than you. And he has a great big house and all these nice things. But it was never about that. That's just like kind of, I think, that quality of life creep that you get as you continue to progress as an individual. And so I just wanted to leave you with that. You know, if nothing changes, nothing changes. If you're not changing it, you're choosing it. And again, this podcast was like a lightning rod for that. It's the start of me changing something. I'm choosing to change. And again, like I said, I really like the open, more flowing conversations. I struggle with the condensed messaging on Instagram and things like that. And podcasts just seem more normal to me. Um, what about you? I'm pretty sure that you would sort of agree with me that talking in this way just seems more normal. But anyway, the coffee's wearing off. I need to go and replenish, get the drip back in. So I will leave you here today. Short, sharp, concise. Let's rehabilitate that relationship with the scales, and finally, just remember, if nothing changes, nothing changes, and what you're not changing, you're choosing. I will continue to reiterate that. So take those lessons on board. Let's all make progress together this week. And as always, I'm so grateful for you listening to the podcast, and look forward to seeing you in the next episode of The Journey.